Okay, hello, welcome. Um, Obviously to the most exciting YouTube channel around, and I'm sure none of you would disagree with that. It is me here, Mr. Davis, Nathaniel, on the other end, hopefully being able to explain to you uh, the PowerPoint that you've already done, just to go through some of the more interesting, maybe more difficult bits. Task A, I think you should have done without any problem at all because it's just copying in some keywords. So unless you're a shoddy guy, and I know none of you are, then that should be filled out. Um, this here was a nice little bit of information about who sits in Parliament, and the different ways we can answer such a question. So, for instance, as on the front of your note taker, but also on this slide here, as of 2017 to 2019, one way of answering that question was by describing the political makeup of the House of Commons. And you see here the different parties represented. That's obviously changed, as you can see here on the next slide. There are now 365 Conservative MPs, and that number 365, as opposed to what there was before, 317. In the Labour Party, there were less Labour MPs in the House of Commons than there were in 2017. So one way of describing who's in the House of Commons is to talk about the party makeup, and there you have the list of parties and what happened to them at the last election. But when we ask who sits in the House of Parliament, we need to remember that that's a plural houses. There are two houses: the House of Lords, and the House of Commons. The House of Lords may be less thought about, but is one major part of the Houses of Parliament that we need to be aware of. And so if you look here at what has changed in the Houses of Lords since 1998, since that 1998 House of Lords Act, you'll see some notable changes, particularly in firstly, the size of the House of Lords, the amount of Lords, up from a huge number before 98 of 1,400 to all the way down to around about 800 that we have today. But also the makeup of who those particular lords are. The removal of all but 92 hereditary peers in 1998 meant that this particular size went all the way down to that, and there are now 92 hereditary peers. We should know that from our constitution section, but as importantly, we should know that when it says elected, that does not mean they're elected by the public. Me or you do not decide, or you or I do not decide who we get to have as our hereditary peers. These are elected by all of the hereditary peers that used to make up this number here. They decide to have 92 that represent their particular branch of peers. You also then have the vast majority, and this has got larger actually since 2000, of life peers, and these are peers that have been created, given the job in their life, generally for kind of personal achievement, or as with the kind of criticism of cronyism, they're given the job because they've been helpful for a particular political party. Because remember, the leaders of the political parties, they get to choose and nominate life peers. And so these people are people like Baroness Evans, who is a Conservative life peer, but also people like Baroness Lawrence. And Lawrence is a good example of a life peer that we're going to come to in a second, but a life peer who's given the job because of her work fighting against institutional racism that was related particularly to the murder of her son, Stephen Lawrence. And she was created a life peer. That doesn't mean that her son or daughters are still alive will become peers after her death, because it is not a hereditary position. There are also bishops in the House of Lords, because our country is a weird country, as you know, and as a leftover of the previous system of the Church of England helping rule the country, bishops sit within the House of Lords. Ask the history students in the class for why that may be. But also when we ask about who sits in the House of Lords, it gets a bit more complex, okay? Because it isn't just life peers or hereditary peers or bishops, but within this, particularly within the life peers section, which is the vast, majority of all peers, there are different parties. So you see here in the House of Lords as of 2017, there are 248 Conservative peers. So those are peers, generally life peers, but some of them are hereditary peers, who associate themselves with the Conservative Party, and they allow themselves to be whipped by the Conservative Party. So that means they have to vote with the Conservative Party leadership and the front bench. And there are front bench peers in the House of Lords for the Conservative Party. Some of them are part of the cabinet, for instance, most notably Baroness Evans, the leader of the Lords, who is a Conservative life peer. But you also have Labour life peers as well, many of them, and even Liberal Democrats. In fact, there's quite a lot more proportionately Liberal Democrat life peers more members of the Houses of Parliament in the Lords for the Lib Dems than in the Commons. 109, roughly about 1/9 of the House of Lords are Lib Dems, whereas compare that to the House of Commons, where you're looking at only about 9 or 10, and that's roughly 1/16th, not 1/16th, that's bad maths, 1/65th of the whole of the House of Commons. But there's also this other category here that do not exist within within the Commons, really, which are called crossbenchers. And these are people who have no party allegiance, do not get whipped by any particular party, but vote with their conscience, so to speak. And these are people who do not really exist in the Commons. And it's interesting to think about why that might not be. To win a vote in the House of Commons, to win a seat in the House of Commons, should I say, you have to win a vote. The House of Commons seats are elected via general elections, but to get a seat in the Lords, you don't necessarily need to win an election, and so you don't necessarily need the support of a party. We know that very rarely do candidates win general elections with the support of without the support of a political party. It's very difficult. If, for instance, I don't know, Bowako, you ran for Bethnal Green and Bow constituency without the support of the local Labour Party, it'd be very, very difficult for you to win. I picked you at random. Obviously, any 9 of you who ran would have found it very difficult. But in the Lords, you could be selected, for maybe some good work you've done in public life, and you wouldn't necessarily need any election. You definitely wouldn't need an election to win, and you wouldn't need the support of a political party. So the crossbenchers are an interesting addition to our parliamentary system because they just don't exist in the Commons. And interestingly, we'll come to one of the arguments for why the House of Lords shouldn't become democratized is that you may lose these kind of, we should say, maybe neutral or at least non-partisan members of the House of Commons, of the Houses of Parliament. So you did this in task B, and I think probably it's pretty straightforward. A few of you asked me, why is there front bench in both the Lords and the Commons? There's not much on it in the textbook about the Lords. Well, there are members, as I've said, of the House of Lords, who are front benchers. Okay, I think here particularly of Baroness Evans, but even on the Labour Party side, Baroness Shami Chakrabarti, who is the shadow Attorney General, a big role in the shadow cabinet. She was created a life peer by the Labour Party and included in Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet. She is a front bencher. This slide here, relating to parliamentary sovereignty, is a really important one, and one I want you to pay attention to, because this here relates particularly to this idea of parliamentary sovereignty. We're going to come back to the final section of our course, Relations Between Branches, asks this question: where does sovereignty ultimately lie? In fact, I've said this to you before, component 2 really is ultimately asking this question, this deeper inquiry question: where does sovereignty lie? Well, we've already come across now many reasons for why sovereignty doesn't directly just lie de facto in Parliament. Okay, we know de jure it does, that under the legal system of legal sovereignty in our country, ultimately Parliament is sovereign. But there are 5 different limits to this, and I wondered whether when you went through the reading in the textbook on this, you would have identified these. Just to clarify, this is the Supreme Court, referendums, Europe, the Human Rights Act, and devolution or devolved bodies, all of which in some ways limit the practical, what we would refer to sometimes as the political sovereignty of Parliament. And as we move through the course, we'll find out how. But for now, hopefully you gave this a go. We'll come back to that question, I'm sure, in later lessons. And so the plenary, which most of you anyway, submitted on to Google Classroom in the comments, which is very, very interesting. I think the points I wanted to make with these, so thank you for them, was there are multiple ways to gain a seat in Parliament. You could be either inherit it from your parents if you're a hereditary peer, you could be a bishop who's given that role, or you could be a life peer in the Houses of Lords and given that role. You could also, I think most people would think of this way, be elected for a general election or even a by-election to your seat in the House of Commons. The most democratic being the last one I mentioned because you are directly elected. The least democratic potentially being, you could say, inheriting your role in the House of Lords. There are loads of different roles in Parliament because our system of parliamentary government means that you have to be in Parliament to be in government. There are multiple roles in government that require you to be a member of Parliament as well. The Prime Minister is the most obvious example, but the Chancellor, any frontbencher member of the Cabinet, a junior minister, so not a member of the Cabinet, but a member of the government, and even backbenchers. We could talk here about the chairs or particularly the speakers of the houses, I should say, the deputy speakers, and there are even more roles. One thing just to point out is that civil servants do not sit in Parliament because civil servants, although they can be important, some of the top ones in the running of the executive, are not politicians. They do not change from election to election, and they do not have a political or partisan role to play. Okay, so I hope that explains that lesson. I don't think it was too difficult. Please do ask questions in the comments for where I post this on Google Classroom. I hope this is useful and I haven't rabbited on too long. Welcome to the new world.